most of the time is a lot of founders aren't accustomed to doing sales. Number one, typical life insurance salesperson that has a fact finder. I need to know this and this and this, and I'm going, and that does absolutely feel like you're being sold to.
I always like to start these things with a quote, and today I have, "Don't watch the clock, do what it does, keep going." And today with me I have Brendon McAdams. He's the founder of Kiinetics, a sales coaching and consulting firm that works with health tech startups, investors, and sales teams. He helps early stage companies accelerate revenue through better sales execution. He's also the author of Salescraft and an upcoming book and startup sales titled Sales Launch. Brendon, how are you today?
Good. Zip code, good to see you. Thanks.
Fantastic. Now, we'll go over the details of all these things that we want to cover today, but I want to focus on B2B sales. This is very important because people kind of lump all sales into one bucket. You've been doing this for quite some time. You're kind of pretty good at this stuff. Can you tell me what is the difference between sales in general and B2B sales?
Well, B2B sales, you're working with a business, and typically, so it's your bid. If you're a business and you're selling to another business, that's the component. But the important thing about that is it means that there's another customer beyond that. Because when you sell to a business, you're oftentimes selling a solution that then translates to the ultimate end consumer. Not always, but in a lot of cases. The deals tend to be a lot larger. They tend to be more complicated. There are more people involved in the decision-making process. So there's a fair amount of triangulation with the deal and trying to understand all the motivations and obstacles and challenges that a larger organization has. Whereas when you're dealing with consumers, you're dealing with one person. It tends to be a little less rational, if you will. It's more, there can be the emotional component of the sale can be larger. Sales tend to be smaller. And the like.
So it feels like the main difference would be multiple people are invested in the process when it comes to B2B, and B2C is more, like you said, rational and more direct. Now, not some of these things, but what makes it tricky for founders and early stage teams to close or to do B2B sales?
Well, I think the thing that I find most of the time is a lot of founders aren't accustomed to doing sales. Number one, that'd be the first thing I would say. The other thing is that they have a tendency to want to build before they sell. Part of the delay is they want to be building. They want to make the thing before they sell it. And the third is they have a tendency to think of sales as manipulative, sleazy. It's something they don't really enjoy doing. And that's pretty much a mindset issue. But I would say those are the big components that make it tough for founders and early stage startups to get revenue and customer acquisition traction.
Now, when you're saying that the founders, they feel like it's manipulative or sales, or they're focusing to do more on the build side, do you see that to be like across the board, even when startups are not tech? A co-founder or something like that?
It's not universal, but there is a tremendous tendency to want to start making the product early, as opposed to talking to a lot of customers, talking to a lot of potential prospects, and getting feedback, and then using that feedback to validate assumptions and eliminate certain assumptions, and then start to prototype and design the product, ideally in conjunction with customers. And that way, when you do come back with a built product, you've already got them signing into the idea and validating the idea and expressing a level of interest. And but the tendency for a lot of people is that, like, I'm going to go off and do this. I know what it is. I know it needs to have in it. And the problem with that is there's invariably, you're going to miss things. You're going to have blind spots. You're going to make assumptions. You may not understand some of the moving parts that take place inside an organization, the people that may not want to see this thing come to fruition, whatever. It's one set of eyeballs versus, dozens.
It sounds like the it sounds like the approach that people should take is to not build right away. First, to have the conversations and to change their ideal, whatever they wanted, what they had in mind to get better at sales.
Right. Yeah. It's the best way to do is have you have an idea, and then you go off and talk to people, and talk to people who ostensibly are in that space, and see what they say. Hey, I'm doing this thing. Here's what the problem I'm trying to solve. And you may find out that you talk to a dozen people and they say, that's not a problem. I don't have that problem. And if you've discovered that early, you've saved yourself a ton of time. It's surprising how often that is what happens. Oh, that's not a problem. But, and what they'll say is, but I have this problem. This is the thing. You're not really thinking about it the right way. You got to think about it like this. And then you go have those conversations and you find out, there is something you can build. It's not the thing you thought you were building. I think the story Slack's a good example of this. I think Slack started out as one thing and it became something entirely different. And they just sort of built it and then figured out how to pivot to another application. And that's when it took off.
Wow. I didn't know the Slack story, but it sounds like people do make the mistake because they're focusing on a lot of like, hey, I'm going to do this thing, especially now with AI, you can actually start a prototype fairly quickly. And instead of doing the conversations, and it's not something that, is explained in a course or something like that, because you really have to go and do it with people. But let's say they started this whole thing, they're doing it the right way. Now they're at somewhere like, let's say, the next step. What will be a good framework for a successful sales conversation? They have the right thing. They talk to people. Now they're starting to do sales calls.
Well, the first thing is, if you follow that strategy, what I've talked about so far, you should be able to go back to the people you talk to, and they should be some of your early adopters, or you'll find some people for a couple reasons. One is you've gone off and solved the problem that they've already expressed they have. And, hopefully you're asking them, hey, would you pay for this? And how much would you pay? And that sort of thing. And so what the size of the problem is. And secondly, you go to them and you're saying, hey, I built this thing you said, and at some level they've taken a little ownership. So they're inclined to buy from you because, hey, you did exactly what you said you were going to do, and they've got a certain amount of investment in that, psychological investment at a minimum. And then, if it is a real problem for them, that's the first person you go to. What that does is now you've got some early adopters, you've got some traction. One of the big problems that people have is making any sale is the level of risk in making a decision that has any consequences or had big consequences. And so if you're going into a B2B situation and selling into that organization, one of the things you have to run up against is, I got to make a change. I got to do something different, number one. And number two is, what's the risk associated with this? If I go from doing it this way to doing it your way, this new way, what's the likelihood that that's going to fail? What's the likelihood that I'm going to look bad? What's the likelihood that I'm going to spend a bunch of money and I'm not going to get the value out of it that I thought I was going to get? And those things are big issues when you're in a B2B situation. Consumer, direct to consumer or B2C, if I buy the wrong thing, I throw it away and I move on, right? I don't have a lot of exterior embarrassment that I have to face or criticism or scrutiny from other people, maybe your spouse, but otherwise you can kind of move on. You can make a mistake and move on, and probably doesn't affect you that much. But in a B2B situation, where you're in a large organization, you make a $100,000 or $1 million decision and it flops, that's career limiting oftentimes. And so one of the things you want to run up against is risk, and so going back to my point, and that is, if you've got some early adopters that are, that you've gotten on board, it makes it easier for that next tranche of customers to say, oh, this is reasonable. I can do this. And these guys have done it, and you can talk to them, and they've been successful. And so that's the next thing. So when the first customers come along, not only do you want to sell to them, but you want to make some sort of arrangement where you says, hey, you're going to be one of my early adopters. And one of the things I expect out of you, how you position this is, is finesse. It requires some finesse. But basically what you would say is, I want you to be able to talk to people that I talk to next, right? And I want you to, and maybe I want to do a case study, or maybe I want to reference you, or, have you in some sort of in a brochure, or I want some sort of metrics out of this. And that's going to get that flywheel going. So, you can get your next set of customers. And by the way, that's where marketing really benefits, because if you got those early adopters and they're willing to be testimonials and references and do case studies and provide metrics, then you're headed somewhere.
So if you're the first steps, it sounds like the first step to reduce that risk when you start doing the sales is to use case studies, testimonials from your early adopters. They're already a little bit invested because you asked them the questions.
Yep.
Okay, so it's a good way of starting to kind of show that, yes, I've done it before. Here we go. Here's an example, and those are adopters.
Yeah, a lot of this is the Jeffrey Moore crossing the chasm sort of stuff. But what I'm trying to do is incorporate the element of sales into that. How does sales fit into that? And what Jeffrey Moore talks about is, hey, this is how new product adoption takes place. By the way, that's a must read for anyone that's going out and building something. It's just, the book's just invaluable in terms of understanding the trajectory of a new business. But from a sales standpoint, if you can get your founders start thinking in those ways and doing that early discovery and having those kind of in-depth conversations and being curious, and being open to the possibility that your idea may not be that great, but there may be one adjacent to it that is.
Got it. Now, if we're looking at taking the right steps, so we're in the second phase right now. We're talking to people and we're trying to get some early adopters. Some of them agreed, some don't, and then maybe we're thinking the price is not right. Outside of just comparing our price to competitors, something we say it's not an apple-to-apple comparison.
Right.
Is there a right approach to finding the right price for a B2B service?
Well, I mean, at a high level, what's the value that they are going to derive from this product? And that's where, again, early adopters can be helpful. But any customer along the way that you get on board and you can have a good relationship with can be useful in terms of understanding what's the value that they derive from it. If your product does X and that reduces the cost of their production by 10%, then you're entitled to some element, some percentage of that 10%. So that's one way to look at it. Like what, and so how effectively can you look at the cost of things and the either the revenue that you generate on their behalf or the cost that you reduce on their behalf, or can you put a value on the brand recognition that it drives, right? So, if you've got a product in your space, in the LinkedIn space, if you help them increase their their followers or their connections by 10%, then what's the value? How many transactions over what period of time might that accrue to? And so that 10% and that 10% that you keep growing, it accrues, it multiplies. And so you could easily see where, you're entitled to 10% of that or 20% or whatever.
Right. It is true, because when I show the process that I have to people, I do explain that there's other benefits outside of it. That's why I do it on their profile. It stays. You're not just building like the base. You're also connecting. Whatever you post is seen by the right people, not just by random whatever the algorithm shows.
Right.
So it does work in that way.
Now
let's say the person is taking your advice and they're doing the right steps. They're taking the sales calls. They're growing. They understand how to price properly. Now they start to bring in reps. And now they're doing some sales reps and they're trying to show their new sales associates, sales representatives how to do these things. When you start to kind of delegate those things, how do you set your sales associates or sales reps to get really good at the discovery call?
So there are a bunch of components to that. I spent a lot of time in this space kind of helping early stage companies or even established companies do a better job of getting getting the sales process in place, the kind of the core components to that process. One of those core components is part of the framework that I use is one of the core components is mindset, having them in the right frame of mind to think in terms more of a consultant and a trusted advisor to the customer than someone who's selling. And that has a lot of advantages to it in terms of getting them to think differently about how they comport themselves on the call, the sorts of questions that they're entitled to ask, that sort of thing. So the first thing that I spend time with them working on is having the right mindset. And then when it comes to discovery, I think the first part is how do you initiate an initial call? What's the right way to do that? Like, for example, you want to find a way to get the customer talking in general terms about their business and what they're up against. And that sort of approach allows you to learn basic things about the company, the customer, what they're challenged by, what their objectives are, and that'll inform some of the ongoing discovery that takes place. What you want to find out is, you want to find out all the, when it comes to discovery, you want to find out, what are they up against? What are the challenges? What are the drivers? Why are they looking to do something? What are they looking to do? And what does that translate to? And then things like who else is involved in the decision-making process? Who else has to weigh in on this? Who might be an adversary to this new approach of doing things? What's the difficulty of doing this new thing? Because what you're doing is a behavior change. You're asking them to do something different. What's their timing? All those sorts of things that you need to, and you're entitled to ask these things because you're a business person. You're trying to figure out if you can solve a problem for them, if you can help them in some meaningful way, and you need to know a certain amount of stuff in order to do that. And so that's what I work on with them.
I was going to add to the last part, because as you were listening it, I just remember like flashbacks of calls that I've done, that I've taken from people that are trying to sell. And I'll tell you my experience, and you can kind of, guide me on this train of thought. There was a call that I remember very clearly where I felt that they were too aggressive and too intrusive with the calls on a discovery call. They were asking like, do we have all the decisions, like within the first couple of minutes, the report is like, hey, how are you today? Fantastic. Oh, you're in Canada. Great. Like very like vague. And then we're going to why we're here. So let me start asking like, do we have all the decision makers on this call? And I was like, yeah, sure. And then how much do you make per year? How many employees? It started to feel like very intrusive. And I stopped again. I was like, hey, I just want to tell you that this feels like an interrogation, not a dialogue where it feels like a checkboxing things. Like you could have sent me a format of checkbox those things. And I'm asking this question in the sense that you're saying you're entitled to ask those questions because you're trying to do a business deal to see if it works for both sides. Is there a way to detect if you're like rushing too much, or was it just me that I felt like a little defensive on that call?
No, I think you're absolutely right to feel that way. I mean, and there are ways to address some of that, and some of this stuff ought to come out in a normal conversation. It can come out in much more organically. Number one, and it should, and that probably points to the fact that the person you're dealing with is working off a script. They may be less experienced, or they're focused too much on the sale and not whether or not there's a real fit. At the same time, there are things you can do to kind of temper that, and you could say things like, "Hey, I'm going to ask you a series. In order to do this, I'm trying to figure out whether or not we can help you. And one of the things." I'm going to ask you a few questions specific to this, and here's why. And if you can explain why you're asking, how much you make, or how long you've been in business, or whatever those things are, then it has a context, and you can say, all right, I understand, that's why. But to just to because there's good discovery, which is very conversational, and it's a back and forth, and then there's the typical life insurance salesperson that has a fact finder. I need to know this and this and this, and I'm going, and that does absolutely feel like you're being sold to. And one of the things that I try and make my customers understand is nobody wants to be sold to, and they also don't care about you very much. They care about themselves. They want to see their own problem solved. They feel like you're on the phone or you're talking to them in order to help them solve a problem. And that one of the things they're trying to figure out very quickly is this the kind of person I can work with? Is this the kind of person that's competent? Are they motivated by the right things? Are they motivated to see me succeed? And those things are kind of going through, whether they know it or not, those things are going through their head. And so you have to be in a position where you're talking to them in such a way that they understand that you're really focused on not making the sale. You're focused on figuring out whether or not there's a fit. And that's one of the things I talk about all the time is there a fit? Can I do something? Can I really help them? And that's much more of a consultative, mindset, and if you're in a consultative mindset with a real, you're looking at things with a very kind of cold eye and saying, you just, hey, because you're going to talk to people in your business with LinkedIn, you're going to talk to people that are just not going to be a fit for you. They can't spend the money. They don't really have a product or service that lends itself to LinkedIn. And you're going to be on the call. You're going to ask a certain number of questions, and you're going to know that. You're going to figure that out. And you want to know that because you want to be able to turn to them and say, I'm not the guy for you. And what you could do is go to so-and-so or this is more of what you need to do. Because you kind of very quickly qualify them and figure out whether or not there's a fit, and you need to know what those key questions are in the back of your head or on a discovery worksheet, however you do it. But and I'm sure you know what they are. And in the same way, anyone that's going out and talking to a customer should know those things, but they should also have some level of skill at figuring out how to get that information without offending the prospect.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm happy to hear that there is a way to do it. And I never thought of the way that you kind of labeled it. Like, hey, I'm going to ask you a few questions and here's why. Because the why is important. If someone goes that way and says, I'm going to ask these questions and here's why, and it's a very clear, logical explanation, there's no problem to give that information because you're on the same side as well. You're there for the why to see if this will work out for me as well, to try to find a fit. And that's kind of where you kind of meet in the middle.
Yeah.
And then it works out. Now, let's say someone is pretty good at this. They're picking up some good sales. They got some sort of a lead gen system going on, but you know what? A lot of people are not closing. They're saying follow up, and things slipping through the cracks. How do you structure follow-ups so that you stop, so that you're avoiding being ghosted or not getting replies?
I think the most important thing most important thing you have to do is on a given call or conversation with a customer is I have this kind of approach where I explain that you need to spend the last several minutes of that. You should have a buffer at the end or a margin for you to get to the important kind of wrap up for that call to determine whether or not there should even be a next call. And one of those, and during that end, right? So you've got, say it's 30 minutes. Then by the time you're at 25 minutes, you should be at the point where you're wrapping up the call and saying something along the lines of, so here's what I understand, and you do some sort of a summary. Or here are the action items that I see that come out of this. And before, now I would like to know, what do you think? Does this make sense? And in some way, you want to get them to confirm that there is a reason to move forward, and at the same time, you want to also find out, are there things that you didn't hear or you wanted to hear that you didn't hear? Or is there anything in particular that I've talked about that's caused you some level of concern or something? And maybe that's not exactly how I say it, but is there anything you heard that you didn't like? Or what do you think? Something like that. What do you think at the end of a call? So, it sounds like there's a fit. But you tell me, what do you think? And then what you really want to do is give them the ability to say no in some way. You want to give them that and make it easy for them to say no. And this happens in a B2B situation. You typically don't make a call. You don't make a sale on the one call. So there's a lot of back and forth and so forth. And so at some level, you're doing this throughout the process. You're trying to validate that there's reason to move forward. And so you want to do that. And then one of the things you would want to do is be prescriptive now. Now you want to be somewhat prescriptive okay, it sounds like there's reason. It sounds like there's interest. Here's how it typically works. And then you use that next minute or two to explain, this is what I typically do. This is what you'll need to do, blah, blah, blah. And you walk them through a little bit of what needs to happen next. Customers like you, here's what we do next. You need to do this for me, right? You need to send me this. Like in your case, with LinkedIn, that you may very well say, I need a bunch of information so I can do your profile. I need all this thing. I need a screen. I need a headshot. I need some background, a bio. I need this. I need links to your video, whatever video, whatever. And they're on the hook to do something. And that's, so that's part of what you would want is you would want to kind of confirm, and does that make sense? How does that sound? And if they go, oh yeah, I can do that, well then that there's probably a high likelihood they're not going to ghost you. But if they resist and say, I don't know, now you know where you stand. You know whether or not that it's a qualified deal, and you can say, okay, it sounds like you're not ready to move forward. It sounds like you got some reservations or whatever, and then you can explore that. But the idea is you're entitled to know at the end of that call whether or not there's enthusiasm for what you're talking about. And at the same time, the rest of it is you could get to the end of 25 minutes or even sooner and say, you know what? I'm not feeling the vibe, or whatever. It doesn't seem like it doesn't seem like I can really be of help to you. And what do you think? And that's when they'll do one of two things. They'll either agree with you, and now and that's a win. You have to think of that as a win because now you're not waiting and getting ghosted and all that. But another thing that's just as likely is they may very well say, no, well, wait a minute, hold on here a second. Yeah, no, I think you're on track and blah, blah. And then they may come back and start to, sell you on the fact that, oh yeah, no, I do need this. Yeah, it's going to take me a little while to get a headshot, but I can get you the rest of this stuff because for whatever. And then that there's still that you've kind of validated, you've qualified them at some level.
It's a method that I use quite often in my calls when I really feel it's not going to work out. For example, if I'm doing a conversation with someone about the LinkedIn outreach and I know that their value proposition or their offer is not clearly defined, I can sell to anyone. I know it's not going to work because what do I put in the message? Or if they say, my offer, it costs around $1,000 or $2,000. It's going to be very tough for them to do the ROI calculations. And I say that on the call, and typically they will agree, and then fantastic, they'll do follow-ups. Now, how do you do that last part, the prescriptive part, the right way without sounding or being too pushy?
Well, I think it's not that hard, and the reason for that is, and this is another thing that I spend time with customers, is getting them to understand and explain the customer journey. And what this actually does is, hey, when you say, okay, if this sounds right, here's typically what happens, and what you're doing is you're just explaining these are the steps along the way, and do this, I do that, and so forth, and what that does is it takes the element of surprise out of it. It takes so now you're reducing the level of risk. They know what happens next. They know it's going to be a three-step process, and they have to do certain things, and they know what they are, and they're tangible, and they might have questions. Well, what do you mean by you need video links? Well, and then you can explain that, and they go, oh, okay, that's no problem. I have those, or they may say I don't have those, and then you can say something like, well, we can do that for you, or you don't really need them, or whatever. But you can kind of validate some of this stuff, and it really becomes much more of a dialogue. It takes the mystery out of it and the level of risk, and just as importantly, it allows you to qualify, whether or not they're willing to do this and this and this. Are those steps reasonable? They may very well say, I need this done in a week. And then now you have a decision to make. Can you compress it? Can you press the sales cycle? Or does it really take you 3 weeks to do your job? And then you can say, it takes 3 weeks. Here's why. And then they have a decision to make. They have a decision to make, all right, well, I can wait 3 weeks, or I can push this other thing out. Or they can say, shit, Zipco, I can't do this, but again, then and a yes, right? A yes and a no. A no quickly is just as good as a yes. What you don't want is, something hanging out in your pipeline for 3 months, and you're calling them, and it's demoralizing. It's your waste of time. You're not getting a good. You'll get the guy will bad talk you to others. This guy keeps calling me. He doesn't seem to get the clue that I'm not interested. That sort of thing. You don't need any of that.
You want to. I've heard this saying that you want to sell to like a half convinced audience. So they're somewhere there, like, and a quick no is a good kind of gauge. I would say to potentially like a yes, and walking them through the customer journey. I think that is something that people focus too much on the features or the
Totally.
What is the service and how does it do now? If you take that example, focusing on the wrong thing, what is a common mistake that you see in sales that people do?
One of them for sure is they focus on the very thing you just talked about, and that is they focus on the product and not what the product does for the customer, right? They don't care at some level, they don't care about the feature. They want to know that the feature does this thing. It buys them time. It improves the quality of whatever reporting they do. It puts them in front of more people if it's LinkedIn, for example. And so that's one thing that people oftentimes lose sight of is they talk about, our product does this thing. But what you really want to do is talk about what does that translate into for the customer? And that's one thing. The other, I'd say, you asked me for one, but I'll give you another, and that is you spend too much time selling, right? And that is and this is kind of related to the first point about talking about features, is you're trying to convince them of something. And, and I think that telegraphs itself in a bad way. Because it turns into selling and making someone feel pressured to buy. And the minute they feel this pressure to buy, they resist, they put their guard up, they're not as candid, they don't tell you what's really going on, those sorts of things. And now you can't be consultative anymore because you're not getting the kind of information you need.
I've been in this position in the past before I started having a company where you're trying to sell the right way. You're trying to sell as a consultant, as a strategic partner, but the business owner is pushing like numbers and is pushing targets, and they're pushing their way. Whenever they started the company, me and one guy in a truck, and we did it like you kind of see the picture. How does someone that is the sales rep? So if we kind of change it a little bit from that perspective, how do they approach the owner to say, hey, look, this is not the right way. I want to show you why this is the right way without putting themselves in like a bad spot.
Yeah, this is tough because, one of the things I just wrote, I do a newsletter on this. And in fact, I'll put in the link, so that people want the sales tips. I do a sales tip every week. And I just talked about this, and that is one of the things I talked about is the importance on focusing on understanding why things are the way they are, and more than how you want to fix them. And it's because it's oftentimes the fact that they do things certain ways because of some level of history, of other extenuating circumstances, whatever. So customers are, some of it's just out of habit that things are being done the same way or being done less efficiently. And when you come along, you're coming along and asking them to change the way they do things. And so that's very sensitive for people. It requires effort to do something in a new way, that at some level they have to admit that they're doing it the wrong way. There's a cost associated with it. All those things can get in the way of improving a situation. So, it's very kind of situational, but I guess what I'd say is to get them first to explain how they do things today. And if you can sort of very delicately identify or ask questions about, what does that cost you? Or is that the best way to do it? How much extra effort does this require? Those sorts of things that can lower the guard and to get them to kind of recognize that the way they're doing things is suboptimal. And then from there, you can say, hey, if you could do it in this way, what would that cost? What would that save you? I mean, does that save you time? How much time? Does it save you money? Does it improve the customer experience for your customers? And how so? How does that work? And if they can honestly look at the situation and understand that the way you're proposing this solution might really improve their lives, not always, but many times they'll come around. But the best thing I can say there is, it really has to be their decision. They have to come to that decision on their own. If you can't convince it's hard to convince someone to do something new if they don't buy in. If it isn't somehow, if they can't somehow own it.
Right. And I can see that you're trying to say you need to be understanding, you need to be delicate with it, you need to kind of lay out the foundation to these things. But it's their decision at the end of the day. And if it doesn't work out, if you don't have the buy-in, just move on, and that's what it is, because you've done the right things. And with this, at least you increase your chances, but it's not like a slam dunk. At least it increase your chances of that change to happen. Now, let's say we got someone that is doing all these right things. They're moving through these steps. They know how to do the sales calls. They know how to do follow-up. Discovery is pretty good. And now they're developing a sales pipeline. What are some of the stuff that they have to have in order to have a proper sales pipeline that is sustainable and profitable?
That's kind of a big question. I mean, hopefully the things that we're talking about now will help get you there. I mean, the idea that, first of all, that if you're doing some of these sorts of things and you're doing them consistently, and you've got a product that, or a solution that really does add value, then the big challenge is getting that now is getting some level of visibility with others, and then rinse and repeat kind of a thing, really. And so that becomes is not really as much my area of expertise, which is more marketing. What I'm trying to do is give marketing the ammunition. Case studies, testimonials, referrals, specific stories about how it works, from the those sorts of things. That's all ammunition that the marketing department or some clever marketing person can then package and put into a message that can resonate. And there are other people that are particularly good at that kind of copy and that kind of work, and can identify the right folks to put that in front of. What I will do from a sales standpoint is, what I'm particularly good at is kind of art, and what I teach is, how is the messaging different if it's someone on the production side versus someone on the finance side versus somebody on operations or IT. And so the messaging, what I can do is, and what I kind of get people to understand is, can I get the words out of the mouth of someone in IT about the value of this solution? And can then I get a different set of words from someone on the production side? And then can I get a different set of words from the finance side, or from the CEO, or from a customer, their customer? And then collect all those things so that when the marketing department goes and does their bomb runs and their campaigns, they're communicating in the language of their audience. So production people would get one kind of set of words and jargon, and marketing people or operations people would get a different set of words, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if that answers the question exactly, but
it does. And I wanted to point out one thing that I picked up in the tools that you said, or the ammo that the marketing gives you. You never mentioned PowerPoints. What's your stand on PowerPoints in sales?
I'm not crazy about them. And one of the reasons for that is in a lot of cases, I think they narrow the imagination. They limit someone's understanding of a thing. Oftentimes you can have a conversation with someone and talk to them about the product and never bring up a PowerPoint, I think. And I think PowerPoints and slides in general, they have a use, but it's oftentimes to convey a complex situation. If you've got a workflow, you've got a flow diagram, or you've got some sort of complex architecture and you want to be able to explain it in some way, yeah, a slide's great for that because they can visualize it and see it and so forth. But oftentimes you can go and do something on a PowerPoint, do something, have a conversation, and have a conversation like this, and then every now and then go, oh, let me show you that. Here's a picture that this helped explain it. And you can kind of walk through it. But PowerPoints in themselves, I find them to be something of a people fall back on them and use them as a crutch, as it were. And where I think they do come in handy, though, is if they're used, going back to the beginning and talking about early adopters and doing the early design work is, I've got you have a PowerPoint or a series of PowerPoints, slides, and you say, hey, this is the app that I'm trying to build. And it's even better if you print these out and you're in person in front of them and say, this is how it works. These are the screenshots, and they're PowerPoints or they're drawn or whatever. And at the end of it, or as you go, like, what do you think? What's wrong here? And then you write on them, oh, you're missing this. And so you want them as a work in progress. You don't want them to be final. You want them to be sort of rough around the edges, so the customer feels that they have the right to criticize them and to make changes and say, oh no, this screen isn't right, or this workflow isn't right, or you need a button that does this, or whatever, or I need to be able to, from this, I want to be able to do a screenshot. I want to be able to do a screenshot of this page or whatever, and they can tell you, oh, this is how this should look, and this is how it should work, and these are the steps, and this is what you're missing. And by doing that, now you come back to them 3 weeks later with a new set of PowerPoints or like a mock-up or whatever, or a Figma thing, and you go, here's what I came up with. And the key then is again to make it sub-perfect or suboptimal, or and again, so that they can go, oh, I get it now. Oh, I see what you did. You did the thing I told you to do, and you did add that button and whatever. And then they go, oh, this is cool. It's still not right, and you got to do this, and it's got to interface with this, and you go, oh, good. And then you come back 2 weeks later or whatever, and now you got the exact thing. By the way, this works just as well with a proposal. If I'm writing a proposal to someone, I will do a draft of the proposal. Say, hey, here's the, I may not have all the numbers in or whatever, or I might have, these are placeholder numbers, and then put some stupid number like $1 million, right? And it's not $1 million. And like, these are just placeholders, but what do you think? And am I capturing this right? And then you can say to them as you're doing the proposal, this is what I'm looking at. Now we're aiming somewhere between $200,000, $220,000, something like that. And they go, what? And, or they go, oh yeah, that seems about right. And now you've sort of anchored the price, and so you know what the pricing could be. So you kind of prototype these things.
It's an interesting approach, because then the person also is invested in the process. It's not just sitting and watching like an audience for a PDF. Or a PowerPoint slide. I also don't use them. If someone says, can you send me a deck? I'm like, sure, I do have it. But on the calls, it's more about kind of talking with the person and see those other things as well. Yeah. Now, we're almost out of time, but I do want to touch on something you mentioned in the beginning, which is your upcoming book, which is titled Sales Launch. Talk to me a little bit more about what is that, or what can you share about the upcoming book?
Sure. So it's we're in a day and age when attention spans are awfully short, right? And you got to be able to do things quickly, and book readership is down, but some books can be really helpful, not only for the reader, but oftentimes for the author. And so I wrote a book, Salescraft, and what it did is it really helped me synthesize certain things in terms of how I sell and some of the fundamentals. And so I did it again with this book, because I spent a lot of time with early stage companies, health tech companies in particular, and kind of walk them through the sales process. And so what I did was, this book is a lot of things we've talked about, is how do you get from the initial idea to traction from the standpoint of a salesperson. But the thinking is that any founder or any early stage company, the people at the top are salespeople. They have to think of themselves as having a sales responsibility. And this has a value to them, in the sense that founders that know how to sell get to stay founders. They get to stay the CEO. Typically, it's really hard to stay the CEO in a company that grows if you don't know how to sell at some level. And, you look at all the big CEO names, whether it's Zuckerberg or Steve Jobs or Tim Cook or Zip Bezos, they're all still they're salespeople at some real level. And this goes all on and on and on. So you don't have to, you still may be a technical wizard, but somewhere along the line, you pick up some chops as a salesperson. So what I try and do is get them to think in the right terms about what sales is and how to do it. But how to get customer traction in conjunction with that in conjunction with that design build role that you have as a founder or as an early startup.
I think the traction is the most important piece. That's what I always look for. Like, it's not the slam dunk or the win, but I see it. It's just a matter of time, maybe some tweaks, and you start to notice, and then that kind of gives you the direction to go and where to go.
And what if I could just add? And I said about attention span. It's a short book. It's an easy book to read. It's very quick, and because for one reason is I want to make sure people read it, and it's absorbable, and so it doesn't have like a whole bunch of extra text in it. Number one. Number two is it's the sort of book that you read and you go, and then you can hand it to someone and say, read this. If someone works if you're in a company, you're in a health tech company or early stage company or whatever, and you've got 10 people, you can read it and go, oh, this is good. I'm going to give it to Sarah. Sarah, read this. And you know that in 2 days you can say, Sarah, did you read it? And if she says no, you go, what the? It's like a long blog post, right? It's longer than a blog post, but it's very like you can get through and go, oh, I get this. I see this.
Yes. So, and I like that approach because I've had the experience when someone says, hey, you should read this book. I'm like, which one is it? Thinking Fast and Slow. And I was like, man, that's that's gonna take a
good book. It's a good book, but man, you got to grind through that. And then there are other books, like I won't name them, but there are other books you go, oh man, this is definitely a blog post. You could have done this in a blog post. Why'd you put me through 300 pages of this?
Now, Brendon, let's say someone liked all the stuff that you said and they want to work with you. How do people get a hold of you?
Well, the easiest way is LinkedIn, of course. So connect with me via LinkedIn. My contact information and stuff will be in the show notes, right? And on top of that, if you email me, I'll send you a copy of the book in a PDF format, the new book. I just want to get it in front of people, and it's just helped me kind of synthesize some of my ideas and kind of, and it's also a training material for when I do courses and do sales coaching and sales strategy with people. So it's something I give out as part of that. So those are the big ways. Yeah.
Amazing. Brendon, thank you so much for the time. Thank you so much for walking us through all these things. You've opened at least my mind to a lot of stuff that I didn't perceive that way. I appreciate your time for taking and talking to us about all the B2B sales stuff.
Zipco is a pleasure, man. Thanks for having me.